So welcome to everyone who has joined us for this webinar today entitled Addressing PFAS Impacts, State of the Practice, and a U.S. Perspective, to be presented by Rula Deeb. So moving on, just a brief introduction to Geosyntec. For those of you who are not familiar with us, I know a great many of you are. So Geosyntec is a multidisciplinary consultancy. We're 100% employee-owned. We've been around for a little bit over 30 years. We're principally based in the United States, but we also have offices in Australia and Malaysia, and Canada and the UK. And our model at Geosyntec is to attract high-caliber engineers and scientists and let them turn their minds to the difficult problems of the day and come up with innovative approaches. And in particular, we put a lot of store on technology development to help solve problems or solve them in an easier or more amenable way. Geosyntec is a family of companies. We do have a number of subsidiaries that provide specialist technical services or specialist licensing for remediation technologies. Serum, MMI, Savron, and Opti. Some of these have been subjects of our previous webinars, but each of these contribute to the Geosyntec family of services. So our presenter today is Rula Deeb. Rula is a principal engineer. She's based in our Oakland, California office. She holds a PhD in civil and environmental engineering from UC Berkeley and has more than 25 years of experience in consulting and in academia, with teaching roles previously at UC Berkeley and at Stanford. Rula has done some very high caliber and outstanding research, particularly in the area of emerging contaminants. And we can see that long list of emerging contaminants that Rula has some background and familiarity with. She has been recognized by a number of prestigious agencies throughout the U.S. for her research. And without further ado, Rula, I will hand over to you for the interesting bit.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction. And I'd like to start by acknowledging all my collaborators on this work, including Julie and Elizabeth in my office, Professor Shelley Mahendra and her student Nancy at UCLA, Professor David Sedlak and his student Tom at UC Berkeley, Linda Lee at Purdue University, Jennifer Field at Oregon State University, and Chris Higgins at Colorado School of Mines. Today, I wanted to talk to you about PFAS, which is the latest emerging class of groundwater contaminants in the U.S., also in Australia and in much of Europe. I'm going to briefly define the problem in terms of the uses of PFAS and environmental sources. I'm going to touch upon the occurrence of these compounds in the U.S., toxicity and regulation. And I'm going to spend most of my time talking about three key challenges and opportunities, starting with fate and transport, moving on to analytical efficiency, and then ending with treatment. So just a little bit about the terminology. The terminology in itself is an issue when it comes to this class of emerging contaminants. They're known by many names. We call them fluorinated substances and perfluorinated compounds. These are all non-specific names that describe a universe of organic and inorganic substances that contain the fluoride atom. Other synonyms include fluorochemicals and fluorinated chemicals. The correct terminology for these compounds that we're going to discuss today is PFAS, which stands for polyfluoroalkyl and perfluoroalkyl substances. These compounds, the perfluorinated substances are one where all the carbon atoms are fully fluorinated. There's no hydrogen atoms. And the polyfluorinated ones include some carbons which are not fully fluorinated. The compounds of most interest that you've probably heard much about among the PFASs are PFAS and PFOA, which are perfluoroalkyl acids. So you can, if you're interested in additional details in the terminology, I'd encourage you to seek out a paper by Buck et al. That was published in 2011, and it includes a really nice discussion of all these variety of compounds. When it comes to PFAS, they're heavily used in our industry because of their unique surface active properties, their non-reactivity, and their stability. That carbon-fluorine bond is a very strong bond to break. So they're used in surface treatments and coatings, carpets, upholstery, clothes, paper and packaging, non-stick cookware, and they're also heavily used as performance chemicals. The one that is of most interest to us here in the U.S. is their use and introduction into the environment from AFFF, which is aqueous firefighting foams. Again, the two compounds that we are carefully tracking here are PFOA and PFAS, with PFOA being perfluorooctanoic acid and PFAS referring to perfluorooctane sulfonic acid. Now, aqueous film-forming foams, AFFF, are heavily used in the military, also in the oil and gas industry, by chemical manufacturers, at airports, by municipalities, and then they make their way into landfills. So they're heavily used, and because of that, they end up showing up at a lot of sites that are associated with these industries. As far as use sectors and the amounts used by each sector, I'm showing here data that was published by the Firefighting Foam Coalition in the U.S. It was 2011 data. All the amounts here in the table are in gallons. And just so that you get an idea, in 2004, PFAS-based AFFF, it's around 4.6 million gallons is the amount used. And then PFAS-based AFFF in 2011, that amount decreased to 1.97 million gallons. And again, if you are interested in the number of facilities that have reported the use of AFFF, you can look at the top of this slide, and for example, municipal landfills, 1,800 facilities have reported the use of these compounds or the presence of these compounds. Now, as far as how they make it into the environment, there are point sources, which either include the use of AFFF to fight fires or accidental releases of these compounds. I'm showing here a picture from the Buncefield fire in the UK. This was a large fire in December 2005 at an oil depot in Buncefield that resulted in 12 million liters of wastewater containing, among other things, PFAS-based fire foams. And the fire and subsequent wastewater issue drew negative attention in both the national and trade press in the U.S. So this is a big problem, across the developed countries. We're paying a lot more attention to it. As far as occurrence in the environment, PFAS do not occur naturally. They're globally distributed in the atmosphere as well as aquatic systems, and these compounds do biomagnify. So for polar bears in the Canadian Arctic, Greenpeace reported that the concentrations of PFAS in liver samples were very high, and they reflect the top position of polar bears in the food chain. The Air Force in the U.S. has led the charge as far as investigating the PFAS issue and trying to understand the magnitude of the problem across Air Force bases. So they started with small-scale site investigations at 5 Air Force bases between 2009 and 2011. And at these 5 sites, the Air Force reported 100% frequency of occurrence. That means everywhere they looked for PFAS, they found PFAS. Keep in mind that the EPA methodology, which looks at 14 compounds, was used but the focus of the investigations was trying to understand the presence or absence of PFAS and PFOA, and they were detected everywhere they were looked for. So the Air Force decided to do a programmatic response at fire training areas. They issued guidance in 2012, and in late 2012, after the guidance was issued, they decided to evaluate the presence, extent, and fate and transport of PFAS and PFOA at 3 bases: Cape Canaveral in Florida, Barksdale in Louisiana, and Ellsworth in South Dakota. And I led the effort for the Air Force at Cape Canaveral and Barksdale, and I'll be showing you some results from these studies. Following the investigation at these 3 bases, the Air Force funded additional work at 10 bases to look at non-fire training areas, so at crash sites and other similar non-fire training impacted sites, and they found that at AFFF release sites, PFAS and PFOA were detected at relatively high rates. At 83% of the samples that they collected at these non-FTA areas had PFAS and PFOA. The Navy followed suit in 2014, and they issued their own guidance, but they exclusively focused on PFOA and PFAS. At active and BRAC installations, they decided to sample all the Navy public water systems by December 2015. This is what their guidance is calling for. And for the Navy water systems not under the UCMR 3 list, they recommended sampling finished drinking water for PFOA and PFAS within 1 mile of an upgradient PFAS source. So if you're interested in any of these documents, please feel free to drop me an email, and I'm happy to share with you these documents. I have most of them. So in the event the Navy detects PFAS, the response is consistent with DoD emerging contaminants guidance. So the plan would be to then delineate the nature and extent of contamination. If there is no current or potential exposure, there's no further action until we get a better handle on how to deal with this contamination that we're detecting. Interim response actions may be initiated to prevent further exposure if there is exposure. I think you've seen similar media stories in Australia. So 2 incidents that have received media attention include the Fiskville CFA fire training facility, and then the contamination at Williamtown's RAAF base. So not a dissimilar story in Australia. As far as regulation and toxicity, starting with toxicity, there are a lot of studies that have been done to look at the toxicity of PFAS and PFOA, both from a human health perspective and also from an ecotox perspective. The half-life is on the order of years for humans, and a number of diseases have been linked to human exposure to PFAS and PFOA, including kidney cancer and thyroid diseases. And again, there's a really good review by Post in 2012, and I'm happy to share that paper with you. Regulatory actions: in 2001, 3M discontinued the production of PFAS. In 2008, PFAS phase-out began in Europe. In 2009, it was listed as a persistent organic pollutant at the Stockholm Convention. In that same year, EPA in the U.S. issued provisional health advisories for both PFAS and PFOA. And if you look at the bottom of the screen, the U.S. EPA provisional drinking water health advisory levels are very low. 0.4 microgram per liter for PFOA and 0.2 micrograms per liter at PFAS. And when I show you some of the detection data that we're seeing at some of the sites in the U.S., you'll see that they're orders of magnitude higher than these advisory levels. In 2011, the use of PFAS containing AFFF and other PFAS applications were banned in Europe, and in 2012, both PFAS and PFOA were added to the UCMR 3 list, which is the Unregulated Contaminant Monitoring Rule 3 list in the U.S. In Australia, guidelines are under development, and I refer you to a really good report that you can download from the internet regarding the status of these compounds in Australia. So the first major topic that I want to talk about is state and transport of these compounds in the environment. And I'm going to share with you some of the results from the work that we did for the Air Force. So for starters, these compounds are not readily biodegradable. They have long hydrolysis half-lives, long photolysis half-lives, and they have low retardation factors. So that's really a very solid recipe with regards to their movement or their rapid unimpeded movement in soil and groundwater. The work that I'm going to be referencing here is the work that was done at Barksdale and Cape Canaveral, and the objectives of this work, which was funded by the Air Force through an R&D program, were to characterize the nature and extent of PFAS at point-of-use sites at Air Force installations. And again, I led the effort at 2 of the bases, and CBI did the 3rd one. So we looked at fire training areas, and then we tried to evaluate the length of the plumes and try to extrapolate what that meant as far as fate and transport. But then at non-fire training areas, we just looked at the presence and absence of PFAS, PFOA, and other PFAS. The methods that we relied on, we sampled existing wells, but a lot of these sites did not have a lot of wells because they're sites that were closed. So we've had to install, in some cases, some temporary wells. We collected both shallow and deep soil samples, and then where surface water bodies were present, we did look at sediment samples. I'm going to skip over this slide, but just say that we did a round-robin analysis. We sent our samples to a number of universities to verify that our procedures were good. And the data that we're reporting is via Test America. We looked for PFAS, PFOA, and 14 other PFAS, and we also looked at co-contaminants that were present to see if we could make conclusions about the impact of co-contaminants on PFAS fate and transport. Now, starting with some of the results from the non-fire training areas, our results were consistent with information collected from other Air Force sites. So we found PFAS at the fire stations at relatively high concentrations. I want to remind you that the advisory levels in the U.S. are on 0.2 to 0.4 micrograms per liter, and here the concentrations are, anywhere up to 5 orders of magnitude higher than that. At Cape Canaveral, we looked at PFAS at 2 fire training area, and this figure shows results from one of these fire training areas, which operated from 1965 until 1984. At this site, we sampled existing monitoring wells, and we installed temporary wells and sampled vertically to the aquifer. We conducted our field activities in 3 separate phases in order to delineate the plume, or get as close as we could to delineating the plume. So we went out there, we mobbed and demobbed 3 times in March 2012, November of 2012, and December of 2012. Our field activities included sampling 10 existing monitoring wells, installing 5 shallow temporary wells, collecting 38 soil samples at depths ranging from 1 to 60 feet below ground surface, and collecting 69 groundwater samples at depths ranging from 10 to 60 feet. And then we also collected composite samples from the Banana River, which is down here if you're looking at the screen. What we saw was PFAS concentrations up to 330 micrograms per liter in the vicinity of the burn pit. PFAS concentrations up to 120 micrograms per liter were detected approximately 720 feet down gradient along a horizontal air sparge system, which is delineated in red on this figure. The PFAS plume appears to turn to the south at this sparge system. However, during the third mob, we showed that the plume likely continues to the southwest towards the Banana River. PFOA concentrations up to 4.2 micrograms per liter were detected at the air sparge system, and the distribution of PFOA was very similar to that of PFAS, likely indicating similar source areas and fate and transport characteristics. The story at Barksdale was somewhat similar, except that at the fire training area at Barksdale, there were very few existing monitoring wells, and we initially thought that there's one shallow aquifer, and when we went out in the field, we saw that there were two aquifers, a shallow one and a deep one. So the first phase, we went out there twice. The first phase of field work included installing temporary wells in the source area, and then during the second field effort, we stepped out of the source area in an attempt to try and catch the plume. So we detected both PFAS and PFOA at typical ratios present in 3M products. The maximum concentrations for PFAS were 580 parts per billion, 4 orders of magnitude higher than the advisory level in the perch zone, and 900 parts per billion in the deeper aquifer, the Red River aquifer. So very concerning results in terms of the concentrations and the extent of contamination. The plume, and we did not catch it at Barksdale, we believe extended out 1,000 meters from the source area. So just to summarize, we detected PFAS and PFOA at the burn pit, in the river, and at the former fire station at Cape Canaveral. At Barksdale, we detected PFAS, PFOA at AFFF retention ponds, at the hangars, and other buildings that included fire suppression systems. And plume lengths exceeded 1,000 feet at Barksdale. So other observations, the range of PFAS concentrations in the fire training area source, was quite high. We saw different signatures of PFAS compounds at the older FTAs, and we hypothesized that the distribution of PFAS's down gradient of source areas is likely affected by precursor degradation. And the precursor issue is a really important issue that is sort of like the pink elephant in the room that nobody wants to talk about. And let me tell you a little bit about the precursor issue. So these precursors are compounds that have been newly discovered via advanced mass spec techniques by colleagues at Oregon State University. And these precursors, so if you think about the amount of PFAS and PFOA and AFFF, it's anywhere between, like maybe up to 5%, and then there's all this other stuff in AFFF. And some of this other stuff can be a precursor for PFOA and PFAS. So these precursors can oxidize under the right conditions and turn into PFAS and PFOA. So they degrade to perfluorinated compounds, and thus they are referred to as PFC precursors. Now, just a little bit about these compounds. There's sort of the big question mark in the box. We know very little about the biotransformation rates. We know very little about their toxicology. So these are newly discovered compounds that we're just starting to understand. So these precursors are a lot of recent studies are showing that they are very important to consider at sites impacted by AFFF, because if we go to these sites and blindly try to mitigate the problem, we may actually be creating a bigger problem. So if we go to an AFFF impacted site and decide to try and attack PFAS and PFOA using ISCO-based technologies, we might create more PFOA and PFAS because we will oxidize these precursors and turn them into PFOA and PFAS. So the study that I want to use as an example is the work that was done by our colleagues at Ellsworth Air Force Base in South Dakota, and this work has been summarized in an ESNT article, and I have that reference on the next slide. So in this study, soil and groundwater samples were collected from former fire fighting training areas to examine the extent to which remedial activities altered the composition and spatial distribution of these PFASs in the subsurface. So at this fire training area, PFAS co-contaminants were evaluated and included VOCs, as well as pesticides and chlorinated solvents, and remedial efforts to try and address this other contamination, non-PFAS related contamination. These efforts included soil vapor extraction, pump and treat, and oxygen infusion wells. So this study concluded that remedial activities altered the composition and spatial distribution of PFASs in the subsurface at this fire training area. This study also reported that the precursors accounted for up to half of the PFAS content. And if you're interested in learning more about this study, this is a reference from ESNT. It was a study that was published in 2014. Another major area that is worth discussing, because it's something we are tracking heavily in the U.S., is the Analytical Frontiers. So in the U.S., we use EPA, we use both direct and indirect methods to measure PFAS. The direct method is EPA 537 for drinking water, and there's a number of commercial labs that provide these services at about $500 per sample. There's also the indirect method, which is called the Total Oxidizable Precursor Analysis method, and it was developed at UC Berkeley by Professor Sedlak and his student Erica House. Now, there are limitations to the traditional methods that we're using at PFAS-impacted sites. Many of these sites have little to no existing monitoring wells, per our experience at Barksdale and at Cape Canaveral. So the extent of contamination is largely unknown. So to go in and blindly poking holes in the ground and installing wells, and then collecting a groundwater sample and sending it to the lab and waiting 3 weeks to get the results back, it really impedes progress in the field. What we really need is a quick and dirty method of getting yes/no answers that can help us chase the plume in the field and do our field site characterization activities in one deployment instead of multiple deployments, as was the case at Barksdale and Cape Canaveral. And such methods would also reduce the cost. So some of the things that we're looking at in the U.S. include real-time field methods to be used as screening tools, and one is currently being developed by my team together with Eurofin's Eaton Analytical. And this is a screening tool that's capable of measuring PFAS and PFOA at ppb levels using a field mobile unit. So we're talking about a $50,000 machine instead of a $500,000 LCMS machine that you could just mount on a trailer, take into the field, and you can analyze anywhere between 30 to 50 samples a day and get PFAS and PFOA measurements at, ppb or sub-ppb levels. So that's currently being developed, and we're hoping to be ready to use it in the field by the spring. Nuclear magnetic resonance for non-targeted analysis of PFAS mixtures is another option, and there's a method being developed by Geosyntec in collaboration with the University of Guelph, and this method is quick and cheap and soon to be field portable. There's a number of organizations in the U.S. that are looking for both PFAS and PFOA specific sensors as well as total fluoride type sensors. But again, the big question mark remains is, do we need to identify and do we need to measure and report key precursors? Because site characterization is one thing, but if we're moving into mitigation, it would be important to understand how much precursors are present and whether the conditions are going to allow for the transformation of these precursors to the assets at a later time. Okay, so the third and last big thing I wanted to talk about is treatment and some of the challenges and opportunities that we're exploring in the U.S. Really briefly, for groundwater, most of the technologies that are shown to be effective here, it's really pump and treat. There are other technologies that are being evaluated, including ultrasonic degradation or reduction by elemental iron, but the temperatures required are fairly high. For soil and sediments, we're looking at excavation and disposal, solidification and stabilization, incineration, and soil washing. And finally, there's a lot of interest in advanced oxidation, but given what we're learning about the precursor issue, we should proceed with extreme caution when we're talking about oxidative technologies. As far as pump and treat, just for reference, I wanted to include here some of the costs associated with GAC. GAC is shown to be, quite effective for PFAS and PFOA, not for the total sum of PFAS. If you look at PFAS costs relative to costs for treating BTEX impacted or pH contaminated groundwaters, you'll see that the cost is orders of magnitude higher in terms of annual costs associated with the carbon changeouts. The key challenge with pump and treat right now, in addition to the high cost, is the fact that where we have sites that are using very large pump and treat systems, we're seeing successful mitigation of PFOA and PFAS migration, but we're not measuring for other things that may be going through that system undetected. In Minnesota, they regulate or they're carefully track some of the C4 to C6 PFASs. For example, in some of the sites on the East Coast where large pump and treat systems are being operated, we're not even measuring for these compounds. So the big question mark with pump and treat is not whether PFOA and PFAS are being captured by the GAC, but what's going through the GAC that could be a problem further down the line. There's a lot of interest in bioremediation, especially given the success with bioremediation for chlorinated solvents. And I'm going to ask you, Lang, to please move the slides for me because my computer just shut down. So as far as bioremediation, we looked, when we did the studies at Barksdale and Cape Canaveral, we collected samples that we sent to UCLA, and Professor Shailey Mahendra at UCLA carefully screened a lot of the microorganisms that have been successful at degrading other emerging contaminants like NDMA and one for dioxane. We screened a number of these organisms, and none of them could degrade PFAS and PFOA under aerobic and anaerobic conditions. So PFOA and PFAS degradation has not really been observed at all in the field or in laboratory studies, but it appears that wood-decaying fungi have some enzymes that can attack PFOA and PFAS very slowly. So two fungal isolates were isolated from Barksdale samples, and these fungi were shown to degrade PFOA precursors without forming the carboxylates. And we're carefully tracking these microorganisms to try and see these fungi to try and see if we can use them in the field. On the next slide, one of these isolates called NV5, it showed some PFAS degradation over a period of 28 days. And on the following slide, another fungal isolate from Barksdale showed the potential or slight decreases in PFOA concentrations over a period of 2 weeks. So with that, on the next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit about chemical oxidation. If you just go to Google and search for PFOA or PFAS or PFC and oxidation, you'll see that over the years, the interest in oxidative technologies has really increased. But if you recall the discussion on the following slide about the issue of precursors, any biooxidative or chemical oxidative technologies have the potential to create much higher concentrations of PFOA and PFAS than what we started with. On the following slide, or on the following few slides, I want to refer you to some recent studies that were published in June of 2015, two different articles by groups at Berkeley, Oregon State University, and also at North Carolina State Universities that show that under aerobic conditions, there is biotransformation of some of these precursors but that the conversion rates were slow. That's on slide 40. And on slide 41, under anaerobic conditions, the transformation of some of these compounds was seen in landfill leachate, leading to higher concentrations of PFAS than was originally detected. So anaerobic biological processes were primarily responsible for leaching PFAS at these sites, which led to the authors concluding that landfills can act as long-term sources of PFAS to the environment, and that additional studies of PFAS behavior and biodegradation under anaerobic conditions are needed. So a lot of interest in this precursor issue. We're starting to hear more talks at conferences, and hopefully it's going to allow us to pause a little bit in the U.S. before we rush out into the field and try to implement technologies without fully appreciating the precursor issue. On the following slide, I just wanted to mention two other treatment advances that are coming to light, and they're led by the Australians. One study or one product that was developed in Canada by CRC Care is called MatCare, and it's a clay mineral sorbent for use at AFFF impacted sites. It can be used for both soil and groundwater, and is currently being tested at several sites in Australia. Another product that is being tested in Australia is REM Bind, which is a modified activated carbon that is used as an immobilization agent. And so far, bench scale studies have demonstrated its effectiveness against PFAS and PFOA. But recently, I ran into the company that distributes this product in the U.S., and I asked them about other PFAS and whether REM Bind is effective for other PFAS. And since there's little interest at this point in looking at these other PFAS, they haven't gotten there yet in terms of testing. So to conclude, I think personally that this is just the beginning for PFAS. In the U.S., we're very concerned about the potential for reopening sites or creating new sites because of the PFAS contamination issue. I want to remind all of you that AFFF is much, much more than just PFOA and PFAS. There's a lot of other compounds in there, a lot of other PFASs that we know very little about. And then there's a whole gray box of precursors that could lead to the formation of PFAS and PFOA. So the precursor issue is very important when considering a site, a site strategy to treat and mitigate PFAS and PFOA impacts. And blindly dumping amendments in the ground is really not recommended. And then finally, real-time analytical tools are needed to increase efficiencies and decrease cost. On the next slide, I want to draw to your attention a conference that we're hosting in the U.S. David Sedlak and myself are organizing this conference, and it's going to feature leaders and key stakeholders from academia, government, the regulatory community, as well as site owners and private consultants. And we're taking a little bit of a different approach at this conference in terms of not just addressing emerging contaminants in soil and groundwater, but we want to look at these contaminants across all environmental media, including surface water, groundwater, drinking water, wastewater, recycled water, soils, and sediments. So I am looking for a PFAS speaker with an international perspective. So if you're interested in being a speaker at this conference, please do let me know before Friday. And one of the keynote speakers on the next slide is Dr. Steve Termath, who's the BRAC chief for the Air Force. So with that, I'm happy to entertain questions. And although I lost control, I'm back to the screen where I can see some of the questions. So fire away.
Well, thank you very much, Rula. That is much appreciated. And as always, here in Australia, we appreciate you accommodating our time zone, which isn't your most favorable time zone. And very good recovery to your computer shutting down midway. It was almost completely seamless. So if anyone has questions, please feel free. I might unmute.
All guests have been unmuted. All guests have been unmuted.
So if you want to ask questions, otherwise, please feel free to use the public chat or the Q&A. I have a quick question for you, Rula, just to get started, I suppose. Obviously, a lot of attention in recent research on precursors and the important precursors in mitigation, certainly. You mentioned that some of these precursors are only recently identified at academic labs. Is that still sort of the state of laboratory analysis? Is it sort of at the university, specialist university laboratory level? Or have you seen commercial labs now offering precursor analysis?
At this point, there are no commercial services that I'm aware of to look at the precursor issues. There's a total oxidizable assay that UC Berkeley can run. Also, Jennifer Field is able to run these analyses at Oregon State University, and Chris Higgins can do it at Colorado School of Mines. But I hear chatter that labs are going to start looking at it, but without really a financial incentive, it is a big investment to get up to speed on the assay and start offering the analysis unless people are actually going to use it. So nothing concrete as of yet.
Sure that I'm approaching it right with them because I don't want to give them.
I might just quickly mute all again because there's sort of a lot of background noise. If you want to ask a question, though, use audio. Please unmute yourself and feel free to ask away.
All guests have been muted.
Please feel free to use the chat line, and I'll unmute Rula again so that she can answer questions. Rula, are you back with us?
I am.
Okay, fantastic. I guess the second question, you mentioned the release of perfluorinated compounds from waste material in landfills under anaerobic conditions. Most of the case studies that I've seen, certainly on the web, have all been AFFF sites for obvious reasons, but are you finding in the U.S. that there is a more attention being applied to landfill sites or any other sort of sites beyond airports and AFFF training areas?
Yes, I am aware of a few cases that are heading into litigation in the southeast of the U.S. that involve, leachate from landfills. But a lot of the, a lot of interest right now is at airports and also the military and the oil companies, although the price of oil in the U.S. and worldwide, because of the drop, I think our oil company friends have sort of put this issue on the back burner for now because R&D funding is fairly limited, and we're very much at the R&D stage, is my view at this point.
Sure. Another question, just touching on your main conclusions, the availability or timing of availability of potential field screening tools. I know you mentioned a couple that Geosyntec is working on with partners. Do you have some thoughts on the likely timing of availability of field screening tools?
I know that in trying to set up a session on this topic at the Emerging Containment Summit in March, a lot of the everybody seems to be saying spring time frame is when we expect to have the stuff ready. I know that our tool, we're hoping to be done and have results and be ready to go to the field by March. United Technologies has a sensor, and their timing is also end of March. So I think by the spring, as the results should be out. I also forgot to mention that there's several upcoming conferences in Australia that will be discussing PFASs, and if anybody on the call is interested in a list of conferences or publications, I'm happy to provide them. My email and phone number are up on the screen.
Okay, we're getting a few questions now coming through on the Q&A tool. I don't know if you can see those, Rula. Otherwise, I can just
cannot see them. If you don't mind reading them, that would be great.
Okay. First question by Amanda Lee. How are the labs dealing with the isomer issue in terms of branched and linear composition? We are having issues in Australia with labs using either linear standards or only or a mixture of branched linear standards? Given the low guideline level for drinking water, I'm interested in how the U.S. approaches this issue.
So as far as standards, like
yeah, I think it's probably the
yeah.
analytical that's being used for calibration.
Right. I've heard of some issues, but I think we've gotten to the point here where everybody's buying their standards from the same place, because some of the earliest efforts in the U.S. 2-3 years ago, when the Air Force started looking at this in 2012, was to do a round robin and compare results. So the issues with the standards were identified early on and were mitigated. So at this point, most of the labs that are, reporting results and offering services, the results are fairly uniform across the board. But again, this is for EPA 537 and for PFAS, the FOA, and the 14 other compounds. Very few labs have started venturing into compounds, into looking at compounds beyond these 16 compounds.
Okay. Second question from John Hunt. Where do the precursors come from? Are they present in the plumes? What is the ratio of precursors to PFAS and PFOA in a plume?
The precursors come from AFFF. So AFFF is, contains hundreds and hundreds of poly and perfluorinated compounds. So most of the precursors that have been identified to date were measured in AFFF stocks. So we know that these compounds are present at AFFF impacted sites because the initial lab work that was done, it was funded by CERDP and ESTCP. These are the R&D arms. They're the research and development arms of DoD, the Department of Defense in the U.S. So one of the earliest studies that they funded starting 4 years ago is the work that was done by my colleague at Oregon State University, and she looked at stocks and compared different stocks of AFFF to try and see what's in them. And I think Dr. Field, did a very comprehensive study, and through the use of her advanced analytical techniques, she was able to only identify a few of these compounds. So these are compounds that we're not talking about co-contaminants, not related to AFFF at AFFF impacted sites. We are talking about other stuff in AFFF. We hear about PFAS and PFOA, but we don't hear about this other stuff. And this other stuff is present at, at much higher, it constitutes the larger volume of compounds and the larger mass in AFFF.
Sure. Okay. A question from Carl Bowles. How much do we know about PFAS influencing transport of other contaminants?
There is only one study that is being done by Chris Higgins at Colorado School of Mines, and it's not really about PFAS impacting the fate and transport of other compounds. It was so we don't know whether the presence of PFAS. It's a surfactant, right? These fluorinated compounds are surfactants. If they're present at high enough concentrations, you can assume that they may change the behavior of co-contaminants in the environment. But a lot of those contaminants of concern, we're talking about some of these sites are 50 years old. We've already gone out to these sites and tried to address defects and contamination. We've already tried to address fluorinated solvents contamination. The work that Chris Higgins has done is more to look at the impact of co-contaminants on PFAS fate and transport. And I think that that work ended up focusing more on this precursor issue. There are several academic labs in the U.S. that are looking at the impact of or the presence of PFAS and its impact on, for example, 1,4-dioxane biodegradation or BTEX biodegradation or TCE biodegradation. And the two groups that come to mind are Lisa Alvarez-Cohen at UC Berkeley and Shaylee Mahendra at UCLA, but nothing like too alarming. The work, probably some of it has already been published in 2015, and I'm happy to track down the papers and get them to you, but nothing that is too alarming or too conclusive at this point.
Sure. Okay. A question by Holly Ainsley. In Australia, we have issues with trying to dispose of PFAS-contaminated soils. Nobody wants it. How is this issue being managed within and across states in the USA and Europe?
In the USA, we haven't really dealt with that a lot. In Europe, they're doing soil washing, they're incinerating soil at some major airports because they're ahead of us as far as a standard. So I think, I don't remember which slide shows, let me see, I think it was slide on one of my slides, which I'm assuming all of you can download. It's so excavation and disposal, solidification, stabilization, incineration, and soil washing. And there's a number of studies that were published in the Netherlands at Schiphol Airport regarding management of contaminated soils. And I think there's a couple of studies in Sweden also.
Okay. Holly, if you want further information on that, please feel free to get in contact directly, and we can try to pass on some information. Question by Phil Reedy. Could you review how the material winds up in landfills other than degradation of precursors? Is it directly disposed from accidents or training facilities?
How it ends up in landfills? Yes, or unused stocks. So I have not personally looked at sources in landfills very carefully, but I think any sort of disposal, it could be carpets, disposal of carpets that are coated or with some of these compounds. We tend to focus on the if you look at it from the AFFF perspective, it's maybe a stretch, but if you think of the other uses of PFAS, and I went through them early on in the slide, there are multiple uses in the industry, and those could lead to disposal of materials that have PFAS in them.
Sure. That's certainly consistent with a presentation that was given at a recent industry conference down here, where landfill leachates from a number of landfills were analyzed, and most of which turned up perfluorinated compounds and attributed to old furniture and carpet and those sorts of products, as you mentioned, that included PFAS treatment.
Yeah, I know that I went recently. I have 12-year-old twin girls that came and told me, I think at 8 in the evening, that they forgot they volunteered to bring 40 cupcakes to school the next day. So I went to the store late at night and I took a picture at the food product store. I took a picture of a pan, and the pan had two little boxes, two little check marks, and one of them was PFOA free. So there are multiple uses for these compounds because of their very unique properties. Their stability, they're non-reactive. So we look at it as AFFF is one of the biggest point sources in the environment. So we focus on that, but there are multiple other uses of PFAS.
Sure. A clarification request from Annette Nolan. Just in regard to that analytical standard question, are you aware if the accepted standard that's being used by the U.S. labs is a linear only or a mixture of branched and linear compounds?
I have no idea. I'm sorry.
Okay.
But I can find out for you. I mean, Andy Eaton at Eurofins Analytical, Eaton Analytical is definitely an expert on this topic, and I gladly will put you in touch with him.
Okay. No, that would be great. I know that's been a question down here in terms of analysis and consistency of analysis, so that would be great. One final question on here from John Hunt. Is any information available on the rate and duration of conversion of precursors to PFAS and PFOA in groundwater?
In groundwater, no, because you know, if you recall the periods of operation that I mentioned for these fire training areas, you know, a lot of them stopped operating in the 70s. So they were operated starting in 1950 to 1970. So the stuff has been in the ground for a really long time. And remedial activities, you know, started maybe in the 80s for other compounds and continued into the 90s. So we don't really have a way of accurately calculating rates. But in the lab, you know, using very controlled under controlled experimental conditions, it is possible to measure those rates. And the best rates that have been measured and reported in the literature are from UC Berkeley. The paper that I referenced by Houtz and Sedlak, it contains a number of rates. Those rates are a lot higher than what you would expect to see in the field, though. We think in the field that it's fairly slow. But if you aggressively go into the field and try to attack source areas with AFFF, with oxidants, that could change. Under natural conditions, the rates can be expected to be slow. Does that answer your question, John?
I think so.
John is muted.
Follow up with yes, John says. So there's no more questions in our Q&A box. If anyone else has any, please do feel free to send them through. Otherwise, you are always welcome to email them to us directly, and we're happy to respond that way. We will make available a PDF copy of the slides for anyone who's interested. We'll just have to take a look and make sure the information in the slides is, you know, there's nothing that can't be shared, but we will go through that process. We also will try to make available a recording of this presentation that will have both the visual and the audio in case you want to listen to it again or someone who can make it wants to listen to it. So I will give you those details in a follow-up email to everyone who's registered. And in the absence of any additional questions, I want to thank everyone for attending who's given us their time today. And Rula in particular, I just want to thank you again for your time in the after hours of work for a very informative and interesting presentation.
Well, thanks everyone for joining. It was my pleasure.